What's going on, everybody? Matt Malatesta in the VYPE podcast room. James Clancy, the head coach. He opened Klein Cain, was the coach at Strake Jesuit, started at Klein Oak, was at college, in the college game also, been, the president of the Greater Houston Football Coaches Association. You are in the game.
I'm blessed, man.
You are blessed.
I'm blessed.
And also had a first-round draft pick this year in Matthew Golden.
Yes, sir.
That you coached. And you've been talking about this guy since he was coming into ninth grade when I was been in your office. But anyways, what does a guy like Matthew Golden do for your program?
That would be a whole separate podcast episode
Right,
YouTube channel, just talking about him. But, I think that, in this day and age with the exposure that any of those guys that go to a professional level or have any type of success beyond high school, they're going to be an ambassador for your school, for your program, and for your district, whether you like it or not. And the thing that we're blessed with is I couldn't think of a better human being to have be an ambassador, for us. And to know him and he and I's relationship is very unique just because, as you mentioned, like opening Klein Cain, when he was his group was in seventh grade, when I got hired, like we didn't have a building, we didn't have, kids. And so I had to go coach somebody, so when we were, be done doing opening school things, I'd go over to athletic period at the junior highs and get to know those kids. And he was one of the first ones. And you could just tell that the kid loved competing, loved ball, loved all those things. And so I got to really watch him grow up from seventh grade, all the way now to going to be going and playing on Sundays. And it's just, it's very surreal, and draft night, everybody was, really excited and pumping it up and doing all those things. And I just kind of stood there and just smiled and just knew that, to see a kid talk about those goals. And he was always very, very specific. Like, I want to go play in the NFL. I want to do these things. And to see him, take the steps necessary to do that is just, satisfying. Doesn't put it, enough on it. I mean, it's just that you're proud. You're just so proud.
And he battled some adversity as a kid, too. He had some adversity growing up, and you were well aware of his situation. And then he's a guy you're rooting for.
Oh yeah,
you know what I mean?
And that he has an awesome family too.
Yeah.
And you root for the whole family,
right?
Because they're all very close. They take care of each other. They're extremely supportive. I mean, being able to see his family going from his junior high games, his high school games, and traveling all over for his college stuff, and then they've been with him, and that's the type of kid that he is. He's extremely relationship driven, and the people that are in his tight circle, they're very important to him. So I was joking with the news people on draft night is it's much less stressful for me now. I get to sit back and I get to be a fan,
right.
And in just being able to know what has gone behind all of his hard work and all of his goal setting, I still believe the best is yet to come for him, and I think that he's going to do a great job.
In the same class was Jaydon Blue, elite running back, and just, took a different path, didn't finish playing his senior year, goes to Texas, kind of gets... but the talent, you probably saw the talent in the seventh grade also. You're like, oh, this guy can play.
Yeah. The thing about Jaydon that I'm very proud of is he did take a different path, but the one thing that he's always been proud of where he's from, and he and I still, stay in touch today. And when he got drafted, by the Cowboys, we shared a very special phone conversation on that day, and he was very obviously emotional and excited, and as was his whole family. And to watch him grow and mature and continue to grind and continue to trust the process, and obviously see his ultimate goal of making it to that elite level, and just knowing the journey. I mean, as coaches, we know what's behind the scenes. We know these kids when those goals and those dreams start to form. And, especially at the high school level.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable to me, and I always try to make this known now, because between two kids, I talked to all 32 NFL teams.
And people might not realize that
You know.
the NFL teams call the high school coaches.
Yes, sir.
So keep going.
And so, and again, we live in a day and age where everybody's trying to get some type of edge, right? So whether it's I'm going to this trainer, that trainer, this consultant, this life coach, whatever it is, right? But the nuts and bolts of it are, the people that are with you on a day-to-day basis, checking your grades, making sure that, you're maturing and growing, you're, socially and emotionally doing well. And, we see these kids from, 13, 14 years old now all the way to, when they can start making adult-like decisions. That's a very large area of emotional growth, for a kid, and those guys know that. And, so the questions I get asked, it wasn't about like what type of routes can he run,
Right.
What type of, schemes does he understand, is how does he treat his teachers, how did he treat his counselors, how was he to people in the building, what all of the external things that they know, and they don't go to the trainers, they don't go to the outside one, the outside people that, are with kids nowadays. They go right to the high school coach, and to a certain extent, obviously, like, when you're dealing with college recruiters, you get that, but now you're talking about National Football League. They're getting ready to invest a lot of money into somebody, and they want to know, what are we bringing into our organization? So that was very eye-opening for me. And, easily for me, it was, I had the opportunity to tell those guys, how special those kids are, and, how much I love them, and how proud we are. And those guys made it easy for me to say good things. But, it is definitely something that I tell our young kids, where people outside this building might be telling you, like, hey, you got to come do this, train this, do all this. But at the end of the day, those NFL scouts are going to call that high school coach. They're going to talk to your college coaches. They're going to ask those deep questions.
Dude, you're kind of off of central casting, like a Hollywood central casting for a high school football coach. Was it always coaching for you? Always.
I love being a part of a team, and I grew up in a family. My father was an attorney. Like, I thought maybe that was going to be, my path. And, it was probably my sophomore year in college where I just kind of looked around, and I had some great coaches. And, coaches have always inspired me. I've always had good relationships with my coaches. I always, felt drawn to being a part of some type of team. And I never could imagine myself not being a part of a team, and just as, and again, anything that is, ever good that's happened to me professionally is because, number one, I've had an extremely supportive wife, extremely supportive family, but I've been surrounded professionally by awesome people. When I got into the profession, David Smith at Klein Oak hired me at 23 years old, and, I was raised in coaching around really good, really professional guys, and I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with the process. I fell in love with, seeing how you can impact kids, seeing the actual difference that you make. But those relationships, just as with me, my teammates and coaches, growing up, now being on the reverse side of it, those are relationships that, we always talk about. It's a 40-year relationship, not a 4-year relationship, right? You remember Connor McQueen?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so Connor's, went played A&M. I think he had his own Twitter account as being the holder for an A&M.
Yep.
But same, he's just like, his whole life is just, he's always been, hot at everything, right? Great player, went to A&M, earned a scholarship, goes GAs for Chip Kelly, goes to GAs for Lincoln Riley, then goes out and coaches. Caleb Williams is a Heisman Trophy winner out at USC, becomes Incarnate Word offensive coordinator. Now he's coaching for the Raiders.
It's wild.
And so he got married this past spring, and I'm sitting here, and all of a sudden, the first time I really kind of started to feel like I might be getting kind of old,
Yeah.
And all of a sudden I was like, all right, well, I knew that kid when he was 15, and now he's got 3 kids, but it was very surreal, sitting here thinking, I've known this kid since he's 14 years old, and here he is, one of the biggest, best days of his life, and you're sitting here and you're going through it, and they talk about those times, and it just really just kind of keeps checking you how important your role is, in people's lives.
It
And I've been
keeps
able to hire former players who are
yeah.
starting to work for me, stuff like that. Those are really special things.
It keeps you coaching keeps you young, but it also dates you because of
sure.
these guys.
Sure.
McQueen is a great example,
Oh, yeah.
and you see, like he was not like a recruited guy, but he has a vision, and he is not stopping until he gets till he pursues that vision, which is awesome to see. You mentioned something that struck me right when you came in here. The difference between you being a 17-year-old and what today's age 17-year-old, and you see it right here, firsthand, every day.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, what is the difference? That noise?
It's just everything was so like regimented, like life was regimented, And I always used to talk about natural transitions, just in the last 10 years, we've lost a lot of natural transitions of seasons, natural transitions of, school year ends, there's a little bit of summer, then there's some workouts, and there's a little bit more summer, and then there's, the excitement of football and fall sports starting. We were joking the other day amongst coaches. I was like, I really don't know when a school year stops and one starts anymore. And just because you're hiring, you're trying to put stuff together and to more directly talk about the difference of a 17-year-old. Like I remember I was trying to think like technology wise, like I was 17, it was AOL instant message was the big deal. That was like, the crisis of whether, you could get a hold of somebody through that. And, playing the snake game on your phone was, the time occupier, and now it's like, kids are watching movies, they're watching, each other. I think that how intertwined and interconnected kids are now. I grew up in a world where, you hung out with your guys from your school and you played against other guys from their school and they hung out with their guys, and you would never dream of training with them or playing on a 7-on-7 team with them or, doing those things. It just, everybody's so much more interconnected, and we have to have some crazy conversations with our kids about, what they're watching, even my own 3 children, like the thing that I have to talk to my 10-year-old about, making sure that he's watching, safe things on YouTube,
right?
Or talking to my 13-year-old about, what you can or shouldn't, put on social media or in a text message or whatever, and then seeing other kids do it, it just shows you just how elevated, the awareness of young kids is to where they're asking adult questions, stuff that I never would have thought about having to talk about as a 17-year-old.
It's so wild.
And it's scary. Like as a parent, like it's, and I'm sure that, I'm sure my parents thought it was, hardest ever to be a parent when I was 17, and just like, I'm sure my kids will, when they have, but it's just tough because you have to have conversations that I don't have any prior knowledge or experience to draw from.
Right. That's a good point.
And so like being an educator though, I will tell you, it keeps you young, to kind of understand like what some of the battles your own kids are going to. I can't imagine how disconnected I would feel if I wasn't around young people all the time.
That's a great point. That's a great point.
But yeah, it's, and even like from an athletic standpoint, try to think of what the recruiting process was like for me in 2001 versus what it's like in 2025. I always give the kids a hard time that my senior year was the first year that they started assigning stars and rivals.
Yeah. And
I was like, well, I was a 3-star when we only had 4, but then they moved it to 5 and I stayed at 3. And I was really upset about that, but that was the first time that, kids really started being self-aware about being compared to other kids across the country.
Yeah.
In some type of rating system. Well, now, that's just so far gone into all the different, agencies and organizations that do all those things. And, it used to be like you would sit down with parents and kids and you would say, all right, so there's 25 scholarships for college. And, last year they took 2 linebackers, so they might only take, 1 this year, and they might take 3 offensive linemen, yada, yada, yada. And you used to be able to have those conversations with those college coaches. Now, they don't even know what their roster is like when they come and recruit,
It's crazy.
And having to explain to parents and kids how a recruiting process works to where their child's recruiting is going to be affected by somebody they don't even know that's already in college is just totally flip the lid,
It's made it harder for high schoolers infinitely. It's way harder unless you're that 5-star guy.
Right.
But the 5-star guy comes with another set of problems. I mean, they just passed the bill. I love that you're here because you can really tell people there's so much misinformation. So the new bill in the state of Texas says what about NIL for high school kids?
Right. So the way that we understand it, as coaches is that, and I just use an example, like if a young man is a senior in high school and he is committed to XYZ university, well, they're still an amateur athlete, up until their eligibility is over with, And so once they sign a letter of intent and they have, aligned themselves, to a school, that's when some of that NIL, some of those engagement pieces from those universities start with that young person. But there is no you're coming to XYZ high school and the Ford dealership across the street is going to give you $400 for every touchdown you score. And those things don't exist. And in my humble opinion, they should never exist at the high school level. And I don't let that might get the internet all stirred up or whatever. But I mean, here's the thing is that we have to maintain some type of societal growth. If we are not teaching young people how to work towards goals and elevate themselves, then, it's just like, back in my day, you used to work really hard. Hey man, I earned a college scholarship. This is great. I got my school paid for. Okay. Then you work really hard. You might get to go get paid to play football in the National Football League, and I'm not against college athletes getting paid because the money allocations is totally different now because of TV and all that kind of stuff. It's just different. But I do think that we run the risk of not improving our young people if we're going to put a bunch of people that are going to be able to get in the transfer portal, go to different places, and now we're not getting college degrees. We're not advancing ourselves, like that, that's like 2% get to go opportunity to go play at the next level from high school to college. Well, you can probably cut that in half or, cut that in half and add another 0.5 onto it to get to go do some type of professional, whatever, So we have to try to maintain developing our young people so our society and our culture continues to improve, and that's the thing that, I still tell my kids, like, the bottom line is wherever you go get NIL, whatever, you still need to go try to get a college degree, period.
For sure.
And I think that, when the NIL stuff starts to dangerously trickle down into high school, at least like with the college level, you're dealing with kids that are adults, 18 years old and more. Well, now you're telling me that now we got to start talking about minors. We got to start talking about, these are state employees that are coaches, that have it's just a totally different thing, and so people don't understand all of the elements they would have to go into making that possible.
Yeah.
For a high school kid.
It's a Pandora's box. Because it's just too many layers to it. But like you said, I mean, how in the heck is a 60? I'm 50 and paying taxes is a pain in the butt.
Oh, yeah.
How is a 15-year-old going to know what to do to pay taxes on some money that he got from someone? It's tough. Other states are doing it, and I appreciate the fact that Texas is kind of holding on to its authenticity, maybe, and not falling into the trap of, we're going to allow high school athletes to get paid.
Well, I would hope that it's the belief that, not to be cliche, but everything is bigger than in Texas, right? So can you imagine, we open that, Pandora's box, as you said, like that's gonna to that level across the state, But also one thing that Texas has always prided itself in, and I even remember growing up in Oklahoma, learning about the differences in Texas high school football, where they always pride themselves on playing NCAA rules, having like a higher level of, competition and expectations and all those things. I hope that it's in that same spirit of we are going to, maintain this level of expectations and integrity to make sure that our young people are being developed so they can go out and, contribute in a positive way into society.
I preach this across the country is that I think Texas is 10 years, maybe even more, as it relates ahead of every other state as it relates to coaching development, just infrastructure for that matter, as it relates to high school sports. And I think like it's a massive business, but they do it the right way because I think they got great people involved with the UIL to the legislature. And I just think it's built right.
Sure, it is. And, you look at, I mean, just here locally, like, you've been around, Greater Houston Football Coaches Association. Like, you look at the professional emphasis on developing people within that line of work, within that profession, and then, we have the American Football Coaches Association. So like after the American Football Coaches Association, the Greater Houston Football Coaches Association, and the THSCA are some of the biggest football, oriented professional development organizations in the country. So you think that two of them are in one state, and then like you see that what the THSCA has done to develop all sports, professionally, it shows that like if you want to be a high school level coach or even intermediate for that matter, this is the place to come because you're going to be developed and we're going to put an emphasis on that professional aspect and making sure that everybody's up to snuff on what they need to be.
In your coaching days, let's call it in Houston.
Okay.
Who was the most dynamic offensive player that you had to game plan for?
Game plan for?
It's a lot of talent around here.
Yeah. I mean, I always kind of, felt like I had always coached the most dynamic offensive guys, Deshaun Hales and Terrence Robinson and, Nicky Brody, and those are the Oak kids that I had. And then of course, I got two that just got drafted into the NFL, I remember like, my first year coaching down here, we had to play Andrew Luck. And I thought like, this is what we got to deal with, like, all the time. Like this is, what the heck, man, he was really, really special. I felt like, offensively, Sam McGuffey was, and I know I'm kind of going a little far back, but those were my first.
Yes, those are two massive names.
Those are ones that like, right off the bat, that we had to deal with. Isaiah Spiller, the running back from Collins, when we opened. He was somebody that you knew that like, okay, this guy's different. But those are some ones that,
you had some battles against, was it Bridgeland? Was Wegman there?
So Wegman, yeah, I was going to say he'd be the next one that I would say that was just like, okay, this guy's different.
He's pretty good. He was pretty good. What about on defense?
And so like, just kind of say, I remember vividly thinking like, because we played the opener after quarantine, us in Bridgeland. It was like 42-35 and they got us in the end. But I remember that was Wegman's junior year. And I remember that was the first time that I remember thinking the ball was zipping like it did when Luck was playing. And I was like, a guy's making a left hash to right numbers throw. It was pretty impressive, and now defensively, like, because I'll be more an offensive coach by trade, we had, Ed Oliver was a pretty decent player, that's the first one. Like, when you watch film and you go, okay, this guy's going to be giving us some problems.
Yes.
And
his motor was wild.
For his size and his motor. And then last year we played the Reign Kid from Cy-Fair that, I thought was a really good player. The Santos brothers at Collins, in the mid 2000s, linebacker wise, I still think that's one of the best linebackers that I've coached against. I think he ended up going to Nebraska. And then, the whole 2015 Katy team when I was at Strake, was unbelievable. You know, they had some guys on defense that I think are probably still playing in the league. There's unbelievable.
Tons of them.
That's by far probably the best high school team I've ever coached against.
It's interesting also now because with Houston and Dallas, I think, are different. Now, Dallas, they live by a whole other set of rules, I think. But Houston, there's a dadgum high school on every corner.
Sure.
They open up a high school, and you think about Katy.
Mm-hmm.
How many schools have opened and just have been diluting Katy for so long? You know, Conroe, way back when. The Conroe was a power. Diluted, just chopped up. It's even harder now to build a superpower because of just the growth of an area. Fort Bend ISD has 12 high schools. So, and Klein has got a lot of high schools also. When you open Cain, did you think, wow, I'm in for it? Or, hey, I got a really nice zone of kids?
Sure. I mean, I think that's, and again, like I was referring to like what I grew up with. Like, you know, I mean, in Oklahoma in Class 5A at the time when I was growing up, there were 32 high schools, period. You know, and, you know, so like there's 32 high schools from, you know, 249 to, you know, the Beltway. Like, you know, it's crazy, right? And so, you know, moving down here, the thing, and just knowing people in Dallas, like, you know, the suburban districts that continue to build because of growth and like, you know, the Cy-Fairs and the Katys and, you know, and in Klein, the thing for us is like we'll top out eventually at 6 high schools. You know, I don't know when that 6 high schools going to come, but we know that that's kind of the magic number for us. But, you know, it was a 20-year gap in between when Klein Collins was opened as the 4th high school and to when we were opened. You know, the thing that, you know, Klein has always been, you know, home to me and you know, my home in Texas, you know, is where I knew that I eventually wanted to end back up, you know, if the right opportunity presented itself. And always knew that there was going to be a 5th high school, you know, in the plans. And when it came open, it was just kind of one of those things where my wife was like, you know, we're going after this, like we're doing it, and you know, and it's special to us because that's where we met. You know, we were both teachers at Klein Oak when I was coaching there, and that's where my oldest was born, and so like we wanted to raise our family, you know, in that area. The thing that made me feel really comfortable about going after the Klein Cain job when it opened was I knew that the community that was breaking off of Klein Oak, I had already served and already had coached, you know, a lot of those kids and families. So I knew, and you know, a lot of new schools, like in the districts that you mentioned, the schools grow with the community, right? So like, hey, we know there's a big neighborhood getting built. We got to build these schools, and the school grows with the neighborhood. Well, for us, you know, we were opened to offset, you know, the oversaturated population of those other schools. So our community in terms of neighborhoods were already established, you know, so we weren't growing with houses and neighborhoods being built. We had a master plan community and some very large neighborhoods that were zoned to fill Klein Cain. So when we opened with 2 grades, you know, we had, you know, 1,600-ish kids in 2 grades. So it wasn't like, you know, we just knew that we would grow and hit the number, you know, as we added a grade each year, you know. And so it was comfortable for me because, you know, I'd already had prior knowledge, you know, working in the district. So I knew that the quality of administration that we were going to have, I knew the quality of support, I knew the quality expectations that we're going to have from within our community. And, you know, and there's obviously just, you know, some natural growth just, you know, from the area here and there, but just, you know, I knew what I was getting into in terms of the type of kid. You know, the thing about, you know, Klein ISD kids, but, you know, especially our kids at Klein Cain is they want to be coached, you know, and they want to be coached hard, you know, and that's one thing that we pride ourselves on is coaching our kids hard, coaching them fair, but also like, you know, we make them we coach them to where they're going to believe that they're going to go out and be able to get it done. You know, we may not always be the most talented, but our kids are always going to play really, really hard, you know.
You open a school, which is probably, you could write a book about that because that is hard.
It is. Yeah.
To open a school. But the hardest thing in the word that's so overused is what is the magic dust of building a culture of winning. And it's, I mean, you could read a billion books on it, but it's just some kind of weird magic dust that's in the air of the school. But I know it's not like that. I know it's the people in the school that drive the culture.
Most definitely. And so, number one, we had an outstanding principal that opened Klein Cain. Nicole Potan was our principal, you know, and she works in central administration now. And, you know, she knew the importance of extracurriculars, not just athletics, but extracurriculars and what they could do for a community and for a school, you know. And the extracurriculars are the first opportunity for a school community to have an ambassador, to have spirit, to have connection. And, you know, when we sat down and we laid out kind of how we wanted this thing to go, now we knew there was going to be some lumps, you know, as
Always.
you're young, and like, you know, your first class is kind of a half of a class because of grandfathering and things like that. But also, like, you know, our community, we knowing our community, that they were going to have expectations to be successful, you know, and you felt that from the kids from, you know, the first day that we had them, that they were excited to be a part of it. They were excited to be a part of a new school. You know, and we believe, like, you know, in terms of culture, you know, leaders create culture, culture drives behavior, and behavior produces results. And that's one thing that, you know, I always talk to our head coaches and to our kids, because those things can go positively and negatively, right? You can create a good culture, okay, and, you know, that culture could produce, you know, good results, or you could create a bad one and it could produce bad results, you know. And so that was always our mindset, is building things that were what was best for kids, you know, and making sure that those kids had resources to go out and be successful. But also, you know, I was adamant that we were never going to play the victim mentality. We were never, you know, we only have
Just
this,
open
we only have
up.
this. You know, I hired varsity coaches and we coached young kids like varsity players, you know, and we tried to make them go through the process, right? Like, you know, I talked to Don Clayton, you know, who'd opened Seco Ranch, and I just said, okay, what are the things that you felt like were essential? And I'll never forget, he said, treat freshman teams like freshman teams and treat JV teams like JV teams, you know, and they got to work towards being varsity guys. So, like, you know, we didn't decal anybody up. We didn't have any fluff. You know, we put everybody in, you know, the sub-varsity locker rooms. And so they felt those natural progressions into, you know, earning the right to be, you know, a varsity player, you know. And so, you just look at it across the board, like, you know, this past year, you know, soccer team wins a state championship individual and swimmer, you know, tennis team making regional finals, baseball team making regional finals. Like, you know, it is, you know, having, you know, 55 kids be academic all state, you know, within athletics. You know, we talk about having a culture of commitment at Klein Cain, and that's, you know, developing champions, you know, in the classroom and champions in competition. And that's a message that resonates, you know, throughout our faculty, you know, throughout our coaching staff and throughout our administration. Then those are the expectations. And, you know, and when we've had our first graduating class, you know, it was during quarantine, you know, and it was wild. And that was kind of like, if there was anything that's ever sour that's happened since I've been there, which has not been much, that was one where I was just like, we'll never get that back. And that was tough, you know. But when we had the first one the next year, like in person, that was really, really neat. That was really, really special. And then we started saying that expectations never graduate. You know?
That's that I've seen that before. Y'all use that, but man, it's like Cain is coming in all sports, which is really cool to see, because that's so hard to do as a school, to be good at everything, and it comes from you as you know, and your other coaches and girls coaches, guys coaches. Girls sports is wildly popular and wildly competitive too. So you can't, you know, that side of the house is very important as well.
You know, and as I mentioned, you know, the principal that opened the school, and then Lauren Marty is our principal now, and, you know, she's a former coach, former college athlete.
Huge.
She's fantastic, and she is extremely supportive. You know, her kids are in our programs. You know, our daughter just graduated, was a volleyball player for us. You know, I don't know, I guess I'm not, I don't think this is like a government secret or anything, but like the most important thing for a successful extracurricular, I mean, not just athletics, for extracurriculars to be successful as a school starts with the principal and the administration working with the coaching staff to make sure that the kids have the things that they need to do to go out and be successful. Because, the front porch to a high school is the programs that get to go out to the state and represent it, and that's not just in athletics, that's, in fine
Band.
arts and band
Yeah.
and all of the CTE things that kids go out and represent, but those are the ambassadors, and that's why like we take a lot of pride in our brand and how we look. And when we go somewhere, like, we're very particular about how those things look, because it's just like anything else. When you see, a certain logo, there's an immediate thought to it, either whether it's positive or negative.
Yep.
And those are some really important things, when you are trying to establish a culture.
And people don't realize, like, on the outside looking in, people are like, everybody wants to blame somebody about a coach or a teacher or some BS. But like a principal and coach, they're running a business of, let's call it 5,000 people. 5,000 people. And they're like a little CEO of a 5,000 person company that is young people. And you don't know what the heck young people are going to do.
Yeah.
You don't know.
And it's crazy because you think like, from 715 to, 235 on Spring Cypress Road, there's over 5,000, people in 600,000 square feet. Right. And so, it's like a small city.
Yeah.
And for us, we have just under 1,300 kids that are student athletes in our school, across from boys and girls programs and all that. So over, 25% of our school is in athletics, which we take a lot of pride in.
That's
right?
huge.
And so we think that, that's a tremendous impact on the overall, pulse of our school. But yes, I mean, and that's the thing too, is just, and I remember when I could name every faculty member, when we opened, and that was kind of some of the neat things that, like when you open a school. But now, like, our population just student wise is over 4,000, and the faculty members have come and gone, and people have, moved on and to different roles. But, it's the one thing that I've always been really proud of our kids is, they take a lot of pride in what each other are doing. Like you see, like, soccer team makes their run, and you look up in the stands, and there's, Alejandro, who just, who was our state champion swimmer, and he's in the front row with a bunch of the football, and, other guys just, going crazy, acting like fools, and cheering their boys on, and it's awesome.
It's hard to build it.
Oh yeah. Like we played the state final in Georgetown, and we almost had as many people there as, you would have as at a big time rival,
Right.
home soccer game.
Right.
And that was neat, and that's just like, you sit back, and when you just know that the origins, you just sit there, you go, all right, hey, we did something right, for people to be that excited.
Totally.
So.
Coaches, they have, their own style, but be it college coaches or pro coaches or high school coaches, who have you kind of taken bits and pieces from?
I'm a David Smith disciple.
Right.
He was the biggest influence on me. David Smith and Jeff Poth were, was our offensive coordinator, and then he came to me with Cain. Those were two of my biggest football coaching influences. And then, like, just because of where I was at in my life, I was still kind of forming my adult personality, or,
Right.
My professional, personality. Those two, we're in, a lot of battles, a lot of trenches, together. And then, just me developing, because I got my first head coaching job at age 29, and so, like, I was still, really kind of professionally trying to find myself. And our athletic director, Strake Jesuit, Mike Crowley, was an unbelievable mentor, and friend to me. I learned so many things from him in terms of how to, build a program that, is intertwined and supports over programs. Strake, we had to share so many kids, right? And so that was so beneficial for me, taking those lessons and then opening a school where you had to start small and everybody had to do everything, and we were able to intertwine, our programs and have that, what I call, cross sport support and spirit. And then, Robert Young and Darby Young, and we have a great AD and Brandon Baker and Klein, and, the professional, the professional back and forth is just something like, I'm 42 now and I still feel like, I'm learning and growing, and you got to do those things because the world is changing, right? But those are the guys that I lean on, and I remember being 29 at officials picks. My first officials picks at Strake Jesuit in 2012, and I'm sitting at a table with Gary Joseph, Gary Koch, Don Clayton, and I'm sitting here thinking, okay, this is a lot of wins, a lot of success, and that was so beneficial for me as a young coach, and they were so good to me, and they didn't have to be,
Right.
And so those conversations, I hold very special, and just so many lessons learned, just, picking their brains, over the years, and even like, after I left and, started doing the stuff at Cain, and then of course, I could go on, but, Shane Hallmark, who just retired, and, Drew Sabota, was, a good friend of mine, and obviously he's in the college ranks now, but just, I've always been surrounded, and blessed to be surrounded by really good people.
Talking ball.
Yeah.
This upcoming year for Cain,
Yep.
I like your quarterback.
Good player. Yeah.
What is going to be the strength of this team?
It's our culture, like the thing that I'm so proud of our kids is they understand and value when it's their turn. We've got kids that elevate because it's their turn. I mean, you look at Max Hendrick last year, leading receiver in the state of Texas. I mean, he was on, he had a couple things, on some couple watch lists or whatever, but like he did some Matthew Golden, Jalen Smith-esque performances, which, a year before, people probably wouldn't have thought about that. But like he was the definition of, I elevated to my senior year. I elevated to the expectations of my teammates and coaches. And that's what we try to preach to our kids. Like, who is the next round of kids that's going to step up? And I think that the strength of our team, like, we've got some guys offensively, obviously, it's always nice to have your quarterback coming back.
Right.
That's a producer and a Division I prospect and all those things. But Zach Johnson's a great kid. He works extremely hard. He he's one of those neat stories to where, like, he was around some really good guys and some really good players at a young age, to where like he understood, like, all right, I'm gonna have to do these things to be successful. We have Nash Langgang coming back on the offensive line. That's a 2-year all-district offensive lineman for us, and AJ Crafts is a 2-year returning all-district safety. Braden Nwoku is a 2-year returning defensive lineman. Now we graduated 6 guys on defense, so there's gonna be, we're younger than I'd care to admit, but I mean, those kids are working hard, and again, they're all excited about their opportunity. I mean, like, last year, we had, between the 22 starters on both sides of the ball, we had, I think, 9 kids that played freshman B football,
Wow.
stayed in the program and just did their thing, and took advantage of their opportunity, and so to me, obviously having the Matthew Goldens and the Jaydon Blues and all those guys are very nice. They make me good. They make us good coaches when you have those guys. But the real satisfaction is when you have those guys that jump into the program, trust the process, and they take advantage of their turn. And that's what makes high school football special.
You're right. All right. What does the Clancys do for fun?
The Clancys?
Family.
We are Disney World people.
Whoa.
We are Disney people.
Whoa.
We are Disney people.
Nice.
Yeah. And so Disney, in some way, shape, or form, is always kind of what takes precedent in the vacation selection.
I like it. Have you been on a cruise yet?
So that is
now we elevating to the cruise.
Yeah, and so that was something that I was not real big like a fan of doing the cruise, and my wife really wasn't either. But they just put some new stuff out, and then the kids have wanted to go on it, and so we're gonna try to do one next February. So we're excited about it. But yeah, we're Disney people for sure.
Everybody's got their thing.
Yeah, and I, as a family, it was neat because we started going like, and it's just like obviously they know what they're doing,
Right.
But when we found out we were pregnant with our second, with my son, and so my oldest daughter was just in the frozen phase, all the things, right? And I said, well, we need to go take her to Disney World because I don't know if we'll ever be able to do it
Right.
after we get second kids. Well, we have been almost every year since then, and I mean it is like
they're looking forward to that.
So not only that, you gotta keep going because like you don't want to feel like you're hosing one kid that hasn't gotten to go. So my oldest is obviously benefiting from it, but like we have 13-year-old, 10-year-old, and 5-year-old, and so we are very much different levels of the Disney
you are
experience. So they've got us by the nose pretty good. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Coaches' wives they're not undervalued by the coaches, but on the outside, people don't realize what goes in to being a coach's wife because people are like, oh yeah, well, here's the thing. Here in talking to coaches, like y'all are gone. Summer, for the most part, the fall is dead.
True.
The fall is nothing is happening in the fall.
True.
And even when you're at dinner, your mind is still like, oh my gosh, I should have called this play, or oh my, what this guy's acting up. What am I gonna do? It never turns off. Does she get you to turn it off?
She does.
Or she's like, I demand you to turn it off.
I'm blessed. My wife Allison, as our first date was during the 2008 area round of the playoffs, and so she we started getting together and in the thickest of the thick times, right?
Yes.
And she's been with me every step of the way since, and obviously all coaches' wives have a special place in heaven. When they get there, they get the to use a Disney term, they get the fast pass. I mean, they go right in. I mean, just from a logistical standpoint, and from making sure, and like it's like when the kids are young, like they do the duckling thing and they kind of go along, but then all of a sudden now it's where like, okay, well, Chloe's got volleyball practice, she's got to be picked up at 5 whatever. Brody's got youth football practice, and then Carly's got this, and so then just like if you don't have a support system, which we've she's from Tomball, so like we've been blessed to have family close, but still at the same time like you got to get them, and then like I feel bad because like I'm X'd out from the end of July to hopefully December, right? But like just not only just from the family management standpoint, but just like you like the the things that people don't see is like the social emotional stuff, right? To where like we wear our heart on our sleeve, so we might be dealing with a tough situation with a kid, or tough loss, tough season, all the things that come with it, right? The accessibility of people now is more than it's ever been. To where people can find you on social media, they can find you on email, they can, they get your phone number, they get whatever, and you gotta, the art of being present is something that, I constantly have to work on, and I'm not ashamed to admit it, but it's just kind of one of those things because, my daughter's 13 and I swear to God, yesterday she was 4, right? And so those are some things that, we as coaches, because we're either constantly trying to think about stuff that we can do differently, do better, or we're being pulled in different directions, And the thing about, our role as campus ADs, that is probably the biggest misconception out there is like, when they print those things, this is how much Texas high school football coaches make, and it said, whatever that salary is or whatever the people think that we do or don't make, that is to be the athletic director for that campus and deal with, making sure that all the other support, the sports, the families, the arrangements, all those things are done on a day-to-day basis. That is what the biggest piece of our job is.
Yeah.
Obviously the football gets a lot of the, love and attention and all those things at certain times of the year just because of naturally, being in Texas. But the thing that, my job is to be the campus athletic director at Klein Cain and make sure that those things function. So that is a whole, I mean, it's you can ask any coach, football AD anywhere. Like as soon as the season ends, that's when it gets crazy because now I just lost my routine.
Yep.
I mean,
and you're not doing a lot of coaching,
yeah,
because there's just so much. There's so many wheels in motion.
Monday through Wednesday at 4:15, you know where to find me. You
Yeah.
know? But like when it gets into, especially when it gets into that segment of time where it's basketball's going on, soccer starts, softball starts, like, there's that little window from like the end of February into that first part before spring break where it's just like
Chaos.
and especially like, when teams are doing well. So now you got playoffs and they're good problems to have. But I mean, there was a point in time, this past year where I'd go from our workout to soccer playoff game to, then, baseball, playoffs started rolling and it was cool. It was fun, but people just don't realize you're trying to be in multiple places at once. And, oh, by the way, you got 3 kids of your own that have
Right.
their own baseball games, their own, volleyball games, their own, choir performances and all that kind of stuff. And so good problems to have, but also just that's why coaches' wives are so special.
I mean, they are something else because I just don't know how they deal with the coaches just in general.
Yeah. But I don't know how she deals with me just in general,
He was like, oh my gosh, this guy is just driving me crazy.
No.
But no, it's across the board. Well, man, what y'all do is so fun. And that's why I love high school sports is because it keeps you young, but there's never a dull moment. Never a dull moment in y'all's lives, which is awesome to see. And y'all impact tens of thousands of people in your career, which is incredible. And it just goes back to the Matthew Golden story, like that's your ultimate payment is when you see a kid like that live out his dream.
Sure.
And look, it might be a kid that becomes an engineer,
Sure.
or it might be a kid that, becomes a parent, whatever it might be, but you're kind of that building block at the very beginning, which is so awesome. All right, so one of the best in the business, Coach Clancy, Klein Cain, watch out for them this year. Another great installment. They had a huge year last year in all sports as well. All right, Matt with VYPE. We'll see y'all at the games.